In the Voice of Russia World Service, welcome to another edition of the Christian Message from Moscow. If we acknowledge that all that happens around us happens through the will of God, then man need not make any effort whatsoever to arrange his life, but simply rely on the Lord and go with the flow of things. However, is this the right way to live? This question was addressed to Metropolitan of Smolensk and Kaliningrad, Kirill, participating in one television program, by a woman residing in the southern Russian town of Stavropol, an Orthodox Christian by the name of Vera Mokrousova. Today in our program we'd like to offer you the Metropolitan's reply to this question that concerns many believers.
Вы ставите вопрос, на который пытались ответить лучшие умы рода человеческого. И полностью удовлетворительного ответа на этот вопрос сформулировано не было.
You are asking a question that mankind's best minds have been pondering without reaching an exhaustive answer to. It is because an answer to this question presupposes a penetration into the sacrament of heavenly existence, something that man isn't empowered to do. We have no way of comprehending fully the combination of God's power, the Lord's will, His providence regarding the world and man in it, and man's freedom. Yet we can at least approach an understanding of this sacrament. Firstly, basing on what God said of Himself and His attitude to people, as well as the very tradition of the Holy Church. It is quite obvious that the desire to go with the flow without making any efforts to organize one's life can hardly originate in religious sentiments and mentality. It is more from sheer laziness and idleness. And idleness is one of the most widespread of sins.
Господь, сотворив мир, призвал человека трудиться, усовершенствуя творение. Бог вручил человеку райский сад.
The Lord, upon creating the world, called upon man to work hard, to perfect his creation. God provided man with the Garden of Eden, which he was to cultivate. The commandment on labor as an inviolable condition of man's very existence was the Lord's own commandment. And so any referral to the Lord's providence and the will of God is nothing but a ploy to exonerate one's own idleness, a ploy both erroneous and even sinful. And now let us pass on to something that really demands serious reflection. God all-powerful, having created man, existing beyond time and space, knows it all. So we can say that in His hands lies the fate of man and all of creation. We can also say so because it is in God's power to cut short man's life, just as it is in His power to put an end to mankind's history. God's all-powerful might is a reality, and of course, our human activity and our freedom is mystically linked with this reality. As I have already said, we shall never fully know how this is all connected.
Мир поддерживается силой божественной энергии, силой божественной благодати. Если бы Бог не давал космосу и всему миру свою энергию,
All the world is supported by the power of heavenly energy. In other words, the power of God's grace. If the Lord did not give space and all the world His energy, there would be no world. We people are also fed by heavenly energy. But there is an impenetrable barrier in the way of the heavenly energy. Our freedom, when it is implemented in pursuit of wrong and even evil aims. Man's freedom is not conquered even by God. Of course, he can surmount it, but he does not do so. God accepts man's freedom because he himself is free, and he embodied his heavenly freedom in the freedom granted to man. And man's choice is accepted by God. If we sin by misappropriating our freedom, we thus put up an impassable barrier in the face of God's grace towards us. Just to remind you, you are listening to a discourse by Metropolitan of Smolensk and Kaliningrad Kirill about the Lord's providence and man's freedom. The Lord showers down upon the righteous and non-righteous, just as the rain falls on all people, just as the sun rays touch each and every one of us. Yet we are able to seek shelter from the sun rays. We too are able to seek shelter from the rain. Similarly, man can hide away from the heavenly force of energy, placing between himself and it an impenetrable barrier. This impenetrable barrier that shields man from the impact of the Lord's grace is none other than sin. In Apostle Paul's epistle to the Romans there are glorious words, good and perfect will of God. Good as in directed towards goodness and kindness, and perfect because the realization of this will leads to perfection. If a person is constantly open to receiving the grace of the Lord, if he or she does not shut themselves off by evil, then they become carried away by this current of remarkable heavenly energy and power. The person goes about his business, manages his professional duties. He never rejects any of this, but he is carried by the force of this heavenly current towards perfection, fullness of life, the Lord's kingdom. And what happens when we reject this heavenly energy, when we violate the Lord's will, slipping into the mire of sin? Well, if we do so freely and consciously and show no remorse, what happens then? Well, then, God abjures us. He ceases to enter our life. The current of heavenly energy flows around us without touching us. With our freedom, which we hug to ourselves, we become like the autumn leaf torn from a tree. Diverse flows and currents pick us up. We find temporary comfort in fashions, trends, stereotypes, advice and recommendations. Just like a leaf torn from the tree, we're hurtling somewhere. We're under the illusion that we are enjoying freedom. But this is not freedom. It is an illusion of freedom. Never shall there be fullness of life as a result of such freedom. There shall be but an illusion of life, an illusion of happiness. What is a prayer? A prayer is an appeal to God to limit man's freedom, lead and guide man along life in conformity with God's plan regarding him. Every time we ask God to help us, we address ourselves to this good and perfect will of the Lord, so that it might be accomplished with respect to us. Through prayer, we restrict our own freedom. We say, God, help us, acknowledging the fact that we do not know what to do or how to do it correctly. All religious life, in other words, life that leads man to a constant connection with God, is life in compliance with God's will. Not one person with extensive religious experience will ever say that he needs not to work hard, or that he doesn't have to do this duty. This person shall never plead excuses that all is God's providence, so that he himself might live in idleness and inactivity. A religious person has a heightened sense of responsibility not only for himself and his family, but for the surrounding world. A truly religious person always adheres to an active position in life, even when he may prefer not to declare this publicly. He always shows compassion and sympathy in the face of imperfection, evil, falsity, and lies. All because the moral sensibilities of such a person are very keenly developed. One cannot refer to God's providence as a pretext for idleness and inability to deal with the problems that one is faced with. However, on the other hand, a believer who is constantly calling on God's help, who is requesting the Lord to enter his life, always senses the Lord's presence by his side. This helps him deal with the trials and tribulations that life throws in his path, even the most difficult of sorrows. And he regards them as the Lord's way of testing his faith and strengthening it still further. So the religious perception of sufferings, hardships, and life's trials imbues man with tremendous strength to withstand what other people, devoid of religious faith, cannot possibly handle. The mystery of faith is the mystery of man's happiness. In acquiring religious experience, we begin to understand what the fullness of life really is, and therein lies the purpose of religious vocation.
You were listening to Metropolitan of Smolensk and Kaliningrad Kirill offering a discourse on the Lord's providence and man's freedom. In continuation of our program, we offer you several Orthodox chants sung by the male choir of the Institute of Singing Culture, Valaam. And there we end another edition of the Christian Message from Moscow. It was directed by Vladimir Dyomin, editor of text and music Tatiana Shvitsova, sound engineer Nadezhda Smirnova, and your hosts
Svetlana Yakimenko
and Pavel Novichkov. We wish you all the best, and may God save you from all evil, visible and invisible.
Oh Amen.